Welcome. We're back in session with your host, Jay, of What's Going On, a Social Studies Network podcast. Now let's get into it. What's up, y'all? Welcome back to another episode of What's Going On, a Social Studies Network podcast. Today we have
Jasmine Gilstrap Hunter.
So, how are you feeling? I know it's a little late, but hopefully the energy is up right now.
Yeah, I'm feeling really good. We wrapped our last day of programming here at UC Woodlawn. And so this is one of our new schools for Lions Prime mentoring this year.
Okay, now tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, so I have been in education for 10 years now. I started off as a teaching fellow, working with middle school students here in the South Side of Chicago, co-teaching and supporting schools during the day. And then after school, I would do some enrichment activities. And then once I graduated from the fellowship, I transitioned to high school where I had my own full-time math class, taught ninth grade, taught 10th grade, taught 12th grade. And then the past couple of years, I've been leading this great organization as executive director.
I was a part of this organization. I am currently a part of this organization. Just to not pretend like we don't know each other. I'm going to get into the Lions Pride questions, but I know you as my former math teacher in high school for like two years. So I want to start a little bit there first, that process that led you to this moment now as a creator of a nonprofit organization. So just to start off, I know you had a very student-led classroom. So how did you create that student-led classroom?
So the structure that I created for my classroom came out of a model that was something that the district that I worked in at the time really wanted all their classrooms to have. They wanted them to be discussion based. They really wanted students to be involved in kind of leading the class in terms of what were the questions that came out, what were the topics that students were working on. And so that structure provided me with kind of a very solid basis for me to then build upon in terms of what I personally wanted to see my students achieve. And so for me, it came down to setting a very high vision. And as someone who knows me, I have very high expectations for my students. And I also feel that with those high expectations has to come a high level of support. So not only did I want to plan for what's my bar, what's my expectation for students, what are the outcomes I'm looking for, but also how can I support students? What does support look like for students? How can I make sure students are just as clear on the ways that they can advocate for support as they are with what the expectations are for their outcomes? And so those two things have to, for me, always exist in a classroom. And that was no different when I started to transition over to more student-led classes.
I know about your high expectations, and I always say that part of the reason or the main reason I passed your class honors pre-calc in 12th grade is because you taught the class. Because like for a lot of my classes, I was going by being smart because I knew how to do everything. And when I got to your class, I was like, I actually don't know a lot of this stuff, and the way that you led the class, or the way that you had us teach each other and do projects. I still talk about it in my classes now while I'm in college about like how you led everything. So I feel like your high expectations didn't discourage me at all because it wasn't like I expect highly of you. So if you don't meet my expectations, you failed. It's like, how can I get you back there? And so as a former math teacher, for students who feel like, oh, I can't keep up in this class, how do you create a safe space for them to feel like they can do better?
So my first thing as a math teacher, and I would strongly advocate for all math teachers having this approach, which is that we have to acknowledge that people come with, I call it math trauma, which is either they are just feeling like I'm not good at math and math is very difficult for me, or they have had maybe a negative experience with a previous math teacher before that made
Mhm,
them feel less than for making a mistake. Because
mhm.
math, at the end of the day, a lot of it's trial and error. You're going to make mistakes. And just normalizing that piece is so important for students to realize that I expect you to make mistakes. It's
Yeah,
about how we respond after we make the mistakes and how we advocate for help after you make those mistakes. So that first and foremost was something I always recognize and I share with students frequently. I intentionally also made mistakes and I narrated what that process was like for myself. And I made the mistake, I realized it, was feeling some type of way about it, but then here's how I was able to process that and come back. Because I think that also shows students that making mistakes is not just something you do when you're young. We make
mhm,
mistakes all the time as we grow. And so also wanted to connect my class to the real life and the real world experience. So I think for me, I really want students to find themselves in some way in my class, whether it was they were really great at math, they loved math,
mhm,
or they're okay with math, but they really, really appreciated being able to have discussions in class, or they really struggled in math, but they appreciated that I, as a teacher, helped make them feel comfortable and safe
mhm.
to make mistakes and know that I wasn't going to let other people in the classroom make fun of him, or that I still value them and wanted to believe that they could be successful in my class.
Definitely. I remember when I was like a kid and I was like, I really loved math. I don't know why. I don't know like who you talk to, like, oh, I love math as a kid. But I remember I used to always think I was like really good at math. And my grandma was like, I work with you. I look at your work. When you read and you write, you have more of that talent for reading and writing than you do math. I'm like, no, I don't. And as I got older and I realized I was like, oh, actually, you're right. I do. I'm a little bit better at reading and writing than I am at math and science and like the STEM subjects. And that kind of like discouraged me a bit, especially when you don't have teachers that look like you, or even if they have the same gender and they still don't look like you, there's still a level of distance there. So I remember like being in high school, I think like all my math teachers were women and were women of color, and majority of you guys were black. And I feel like that is also what made the experience so much more comfortable for me because I'm like, okay, you especially the way you described it, sometime when I was in math class, I'm like, "Okay, yeah, I'm smart, but the way this math is being described is not fitting." And so the way that you help describe math and the way that you help break it down, I was like, "I actually am starting to understand this." And even, like, the atmosphere of your classroom, like, when you played music, you had us create our own playlist for the music, and, like, even when, like, we would ask so many questions, you were like, "Okay, figure it out first. Let's see what you do, and then come back." And I'm like, okay, not okay. This is a little weird because we're so used to depending on our teachers. And I feel like you creating like that independence for us really helped. And I think that leads perfectly into my next question. I love when conversations lead perfectly into my next question. So as a former teacher and as a nonprofit creator right now, what did you view restorative education as in the classroom? And how do you view restorative education now outside of the classroom?
So for me, and from my experience, both when I was an undergraduate as well as conferences I have been to since I graduated from undergrad, I believe that restorative justice at its heart is about support and respect.
Mhm,
Not dissimilar from my beliefs of high expectations and high support, right? So it's all connected in that same thread. But I think restorative education specifically is about behaviors, and it's
mhm,
about not addressing behaviors from I think historically punitive negative lens,
mhm,
but that behaviors are just actions and every action has a consequence, and a consequence can be positive or it can be negative. And so I think making sure that when students were exhibiting actions and doing things that were not necessarily aligned with my expectations
mhm,
or were something that I felt like violated the respect that we had created in our classroom, it's having the conversation. It's
mhm.
restoring that relationship. It's restoring those expectations to that being the norm. And I think that happens when you have great conversations with
Yeah.
people. And I also think specifically when you are an educator and you work with young people, it's listening to them because
Mhm,
sometimes there is a miscommunication and adults can be guilty of miscommunicating and adults could also be guilty of not listening or fully hearing what students are saying. And so I think it's really important for me. I always had that perspective when I was in a classroom setting and I continue working with young people to make sure that I am listening to what they are saying
mhm,
and that they feel like they can come to me with feedback, with thoughts, with suggestions. And I think that that is something that I've always appreciated about young people and continue to appreciate. Even as a nonprofit leader, we do surveys. And one of the things that I love is like I read every single survey that we administer, and we administer surveys 3 times a year. I
Mhm.
love reading the comments. They're just not as many as I like for there to be. But I always read the comments. And when I was still teaching, when we would do these quarterly surveys where we would get feedback on our individual classes, I would also read all the comments. And then I
Mhm.
would dedicate an entire class period to let's debrief what were the common threads that I
Mhm.
saw, and let's have a discussion about it. And there would be times where kids would make suggestions. I'm like, that's a really great idea, but that doesn't feel authentic to me as a teacher.
Mm.
That's not my energy. Right. And so acknowledging that I hear them, it doesn't necessarily mean you're committing to making that change, or that that change is authentic to you, but it's
Mhm.
just the idea of them feeling heard and like I share my thought and my opinion and it was valued. That goes so far with students. And I think that is part of restorative education as
Definitely.
well. And that's where I think I stood as a classroom teacher, and I still stand as a nonprofit leader, that we have to listen to the young people because they're the ones receiving our services. And
Mhm.
so if they're unhappy, we need to know why. And there's going to be changes we can make, but there also might not be changes that we make, and we need to also articulate why we're not making those changes. And I think that, again, starts with support and respect. Support to give kids the opportunity to be able to articulate their needs and the resources to do so. And then the respect to honor and value when we're getting those things. Because there's lots of people who get surveys, but are you actually doing
Yeah.
actions? Are you actually listening to the young people and the concerns that they are articulating?
I think to your point about you like being authentic to yourself, I had you 10th grade, 12th grade, and then I was a mentor in the program. I feel like you were the same person every time. Like, and it wasn't like you didn't, oh, you stayed stagnant. It was you were your best self every time I was in your classroom. And I also feel like I had the best grades when I was in class. I'm not just saying that because you're my boss now, but no, I really think like I worked really hard in your class. I felt really comfortable in your class, and I feel like I didn't just have to be smart anymore. I could actually just ask questions. I can actually relax. I can actually work hard and achieve what you wanted me to achieve. Because even though like you were a teacher, and then I like in my mind I like thought of you as like the big mentor when I was in high school. So I'm like, okay, I'm the mentor, and then I have my mentee, and then we have the big mentor, and I'm like, okay, as a teacher, as a big mentor, you had like different roles, but you were still the same person. You still listened to us. You were still compassionate. You still had that exterior of like, don't play with me though. I'm like, I'm compassionate and I'm here for you, but like, look, I'm also here to make sure like I create discipline in you, and I'm moving you forward to do even better after me than when you were with me. And I feel like you're the same person now that I had when you were like my big mentor and when you were my teacher. And I really appreciate that because I feel like a lot of the times some teachers, especially like now within the climate that we're in, they feel like they have to change the whole trajectory of who they are because they don't want to seem racist and they don't want to seem harmful. But there can be a harmful aspect to that when you're closing yourself so off so much because you're scared to hurt students that you actually do end up hurting them. And I feel like also too, I feel like I got like the least demerits in your class. I feel like sometimes I'll get demerits. I'm like, wait, I'm a good student. What am I doing? Like, I have like these demerits. But I'm like in your class, I feel like there was never really a time for me to get them because you allowed us to talk. You allowed us to be social, which I feel like was a very great aspect of your class because those college problems that you would give sometimes were hard. I was like, we needed to interact with each other. And I thought that was very beautiful. And thinking about, being the big mentor now, and an even bigger mentor because, you have a nonprofit organization. What is Lions Pride Mentorship?
Yeah, so Lions Pride Mentoring is a peer-to-peer mentoring organization here in Chicago. It's based on the program that you were part of when you were at Baker, and it is really rooted in that concept of student voice. And
Hmm.
so I think a lot of times adults, especially in the mentorship space, adults feel like I had this experience. I want to give back to the community. I think that's beautiful and that's wonderful. And I think there's opportunities for us to train the next generation of leaders. And I think that our program is a way that we can train the next generation of leaders. So we train a lot of the 12th grade students to be mentors to the younger students in their school. And what I really love about our work is that it's really taking the idea of mentorship and putting it back in the hands of the students.
Hmm.
And with that, we are addressing some potential challenges you see very common in the mentorship space, which is that we have 100% mentors of color,
Hmm.
which is very rare. And it only happens because we're tapping directly into the source of the students that we're serving, which are 100% students of color. And
Hmm.
so our program is a school-based program. And so we partner with high schools throughout Chicago to provide this program to students. And it's been a labor of love. It's been a labor of love. And I'm very proud of where we are as a as an organization.
Before I get into the next questions, I got so excited. I forgot to ask you the question that I always ask everyone. And I purposely don't send you the question because I'm like, I want to see what you say. What did you think social studies was before you got into teaching and before you became a nonprofit creator? And what do you think of social studies now with your roles?
So, social studies to me growing up was a combination of history and culture, but I say it more
Mhm.
so in the perspective from like, here are the traditions of different cultures, and also here are the traditions of America.
Mhm.
So I say
Mhm.
culture, I'm thinking about we would do different arts and crafts for the main holidays, so like Thanksgiving and Christmas and Easter. But then also you get a St. Patrick's Day every now and then.
Mhm.
I do actually have a very, maybe it's a funny story, but it was kind of traumatizing for
Oh,
me
okay.
about St. Patrick's Day when I was, I think, in first grade. My teacher really ramped up this like myth of the leprechaun, and we came back from recess and all of our desks and tables were overturned, and she was like, there's a leprechaun on the loose in our classroom, and it freaked me out. And I couldn't sleep at night. And my parents, this is how old I am. My parents, we had a set of encyclopedias at home. My parents got out the encyclopedia with L on it for a leprechaun, and they made me read the entry for leprechauns that they were a mythical creature so I can go to sleep that night. So I'm not saying don't talk about St. Patrick's Day, but maybe don't do that full on like
They destroyed our classroom.
they like a leprechaun broke out of your classroom. That was like very, very traumatizing. But that was what social studies was for me growing up. And I think I liked it. I like learning about other countries, the countries of the world, learning about Antarctica and continents.
Mhm.
Um, but now as a teacher who has never taught social studies, and I will
Mhm.
definitely say that specifically, I think social studies now is still the same as when I was younger. So it's still very much rooted about learning about cultures, learning about history.
Mhm.
But I think we have a different perspective than we did when I was growing up. I think growing up, it felt more generalized,
Mm.
like they
Mhm.
were trying to appease kind of everybody.
Mhm.
And I think now social studies is really trying to be more intentional about filling in some of those gaps that have historically been excluded. So learning
Mhm.
more about, Black culture, and learning more about, Asian American culture, and, Latinx culture. And I think those are things that I think are great about social studies now compared to
Mhm.
when I was young, because I think we got kind of like your standard American
Yeah.
kind of perspective, and now we're getting in more detailed perspectives of those communities and those cultures.
Definitely. And with being intentional about what we learn and learning about perspectives and cultures and histories and catering to groups that weren't necessarily catered to, I feel like that's what you do with your mentorship. So what inspired you to co-create Lions Pride Mentorship Program?
Yeah. So for me, I think the creation was a combination of myself and Sean Healy at
Hmm.
Baker. I think Sean had a really great idea for leveraging student voice through this mentorship aspect. For me, what inspires me and what inspired me to get involved and co-created with Sean, but also what continues to inspire me is my own experience actually.
Hmm.
Um, and for me, when I was in ninth grade myself, which we predominantly have ninth graders serve as our mentees in our program. When I was in ninth grade, I was in color guard. And I was also a true early 2000s kid. I was very into the pop punk movement. I was very emo.
I
I,
remember you showed us
I
the
yes,
picture.
I have my like side part, my black fingernails, and like lots and lots of eyeliner. And so for me, when I transitioned to high school, I went to a large high school also,
Hmm.
and I felt kind of lost. I was kind of not a big person on campus in my middle school, but definitely knew a lot of my classmates. And going to high school, didn't really know a ton of people.
Hmm.
And being on color guard and being a part of the marching band was really great. But what I really enjoyed about that experience the most was I had what they called a big sister. And that was someone who it's kind of very interesting. It felt very sorority like,
Okay.
because I didn't know who she was at first. It was like she would leave me like gifts by my locker and stuff. And eventually, when we went to band camp, she revealed who she was, and like we had a really great relationship throughout the course of that first year and the second year that I was a part of the program. But for me, I think that's the power of our mentorship program is the
Definitely.
idea of students helping students and students having a very unique perspective that adults just can't really capture. Like
Hmm.
I've never been a student in my colleague's classroom. You have, or you were, right? And
Yeah.
so you have a perspective, you have experience with those teachers in a way that I, as an adult, will never have. And I think that's part of the power and the magic of our program. And that is what also continues to inspire me now is having seen that first couple of class of students be mentors, and to see how you all got roped into conversations like, unfortunately, some of the, mentees would get into fights, and you all would be part of those kind of restorative conversations yourselves as 11th graders, right? And there were teachers that felt uncomfortable in those conversations. You are like, I want to be in that conversation with them. I want to help advocate for my mentee. And so seeing how we're already instilling those values in you all as a next generation is beautiful to see.
I definitely can speak to all of those experiences. For one, I still talk to some of my mentees now. I just went to one of my mentees' prom send off. I literally almost cried, and I'm like, "No, I gotta thug it out. I can't cry in front of all these people. I gotta wait to cry." I was like, she was so beautiful, and to see who she was as a freshman, and to see who she is like now graduating, which honestly makes me feel a little old because I'm like, I was like just in high school like 3 years ago, but I'm like, now you're graduating and I'm about to graduate. There's a lot going on right now. But it was just so nice just to see her, just that blossoming personality, just to see like I still seen remnants of her as a freshman, but I'm like, you're not a freshman anymore.
Yeah.
And I remember like some days like where she wanted to get into a fight. I'm like, no, what we're gonna do, we're gonna turn around, we're gonna leave this person, we're gonna go around the school instead of going up the stairs you wanted to go to, and we're gonna have a talk. And I remember like because everyone knew what the mentorship was, a lot of kids were like, get your mentee. And I'm like, I'm on the way. Please don't do anything. I am coming. I'm rushing there now. And even then they taught me the way I feel like I taught them. Like sometimes my mentees were like, "You worried about our grades? Let's see what your grades looking like. What are you doing in class?" And I was like, "Uh oh." They were like, "Les, you talking about us and asking us how we're feeling. How are you feeling today?" And I'm like, "Okay, well, I'll actually show you my grades. Like, let's talk about it. Let's talk about what we're doing. Let's talk about how you can model me and how you can do better and how you can learn from my experiences and get to where I'm at. So maybe like you could be big too," which I thought was extremely like it was a very nice experience. Especially I know I had an experience where I actually went into in-school suspension with one of my mentees because I'm like, I need to have a conversation with him. I need to see like what's going through his mind right now. Just how can we move past this? How can we move forward? How can we, make sure like we're not in this position again? And at first, I didn't think he was going to talk to me because I remember during our training process, there were experiences where the former bigs were like, or previous bigs, they were saying sometimes they're not going to talk to you. You need to give them time to open up. And it took him a while because he was angry, and I'm like, "Okay, I understand, like, you don't wanna be in here right now, but, I'm gonna stay in here with you for lunch too, just so I'll get you your lunch and let's talk about it," and we did, and I feel like, we had a very good conversation. I also feel like that built a lot of trust, which I was like it made me feel very, very good as a mentor. Because 'cause I'm like,
Yeah.
I always wanna make sure I'm building trust and they understand that they can, like, trust me and talk to me and know that I won't put put them on blast, but I will let them know, like, "This is unacceptable." Because not only representing you, you're representing
Yeah.
me as your mentor, and I'm not having that. And
Yeah.
so, it felt nice because I wasn't only a mentor, I feel like a big sister and an older sister. And I'm like, I still talk about that. I still talk about my mentor experiences in all my classes and with all my other classmates who are future educators. I love saying I'm gonna be a future educator.
Yeah.
But with that, what did the journey and the process look like for this mentorship, for this program, like starting out at Baker College Prep, which is a small high school, watching that blossom, watching that grow, and then being able to spread it to other campuses and watching that blossom and watching that grow. And then what does the journey look like now as an actual like full-on nonprofit organization?
Yeah, so I will definitely say that first year, Sean and I had a lot of work ahead of us, and I don't think that we realized it back then, how much work it took for us to create the program. I think we had an idea, and then we started breaking down all the steps that we needed to take. And so the once we had the idea and once we finalized, like, all right, it's going to be me leading the class and Sean kind of supporting and coaching as much as possible.
Mhm.
And so after that, we're like, all right, how are we going to get mentors? Right?
Okay.
We're like, wait, we want students to be mentors. How do you make that happen? So creating that whole application process from the questions on the interview and the questions on the application, and when are we doing interviews and how are we doing interviews and how are we scheduling all of that, and when are we training students and how are we training students and what's the content of training going to look like, and then when do we include the mentees and what space do we need. And so there was a lot of planning involved in establishing that program just the first year at Baker.
Mhm.
And one thing that I really appreciated and I loved was us selecting the students at the end of the year, because it
Mhm.
allowed them to have that experience over the summer to kind of see who the new freshmen would be,
Mm.
not from the
Mhm.
perspective of, okay, I got to scope these people out, but from the perspective of I want to start practicing my natural instincts when it comes to supporting ninth grade students, so that when I come back in the fall and actually starts training, I can draw on some of those experiences as I'm learning new techniques and new strategies to be an even better mentor. And
Mhm.
so I think it was a learning curve for us that first year for sure, realizing that some students just needed one mentee and some students could handle two, because I
Yeah.
think we gave everybody two the first year. In the second year,
Oh,
we were like,
okay.
okay, let's reflect. Let's see, should this person have one? Should they have two? Based on how people were doing in the training process, adjusting the training process, getting feedback from that first cohort of mentors, and updating our curriculum that way. I think also where we start to shift was really trying to figure out the social emotional learning component, which is a huge
Mhm.
component of our programming now. We have our own curriculum. It's been vetted by a social worker and a school psychologist.
Mm.
And it's something that we are very proud of. And especially the past couple of years, that's probably been like the biggest thing for us, is
Mhm.
making sure that we continue with that social emotional learning component. And so after that first year, did all those changes and tweaks, started thinking about an actual standardized curriculum with social emotional learning standards. We actually had a second school that was interested in the program at that point. And so I, over the summer, in between the first year and second year at Baker, trained that person at that school to lead our programming. And they had programming there, but it wasn't like it was at Baker. It was
Mhm.
not, Baker was during the school day. That program was like during advisory at the very end of the day.
Okay.
And at Baker, yes, we had 30 minutes. They had 30 minutes too, but it was a different quality of time. We weren't, they weren't doing those like SEL lessons. We were doing those SEL lessons at Baker. And so that second year was very much about, all right, we know that what we're doing at Baker is working. We know that what we're doing at Baker can be transferable to other schools, but there's a challenge with it being at other schools without
Mhm.
some oversight.
Mm.
And at the time, I was still teaching full time. I think at that point, Sean was the assistant principal at Baker.
Mhm.
And so we both have full time jobs. And we were like, all right, let's start thinking about how we could create something outside the two of us that can manage this
Mhm.
program. And so that's when we started to toy with the idea of creating a nonprofit and then actually making steps towards becoming a nonprofit.
Mhm.
And that was year 3 of us being at Baker's, when we
Okay.
finally became a nonprofit. So September of 2019, we became a 501c3. And obviously, what happened shortly after in 2020.
Yeah, very
And
unfortunate.
that it was hard because we had a board of directors and we had people who were very passionate, excited about the work. We had interviewed people to be executive director because I still wanted to teach full time.
Mhm.
And with all of that happened, we kind of put a pause on a lot of our things
Oh.
because there were just so many unknowns. And I think that kind of happened across the world. There were so many
Mhm.
unknowns and a lot of things were put on pause. But we reconvened in the summer. And at that point, because I was teaching remotely, I foolishly decided, what, I'm going to be executive director. I'm going to lead this nonprofit while I am teaching virtually. Terrible life decision. I really appreciate my husband for all of his support that year. I definitely could have not been doing 2 jobs. They were both very ambitious. That required a ton of work from me, but we made it happen. And we actually were able to expand during that year. We expanded to a 3rd campus and we're able to really create structures and supports to create that consistency
Mhm.
across the 3 campuses we were in. Started having conversations about expanding to some of our other school partners as well and laying the groundwork. And at the end of that school year, I transitioned into what I do now, which is being executive director full time of the organization. And since I left the classroom in 2021, we have expanded from 3 schools to 5. We have a 6th campus that is signed on to start next year, and we're
Yay.
still in conversations. Our goal is to be in 10 schools for next school year. It's very ambitious,
Okay.
but I'm really excited about that opportunity for us to grow. I think we've been able to make a name for ourselves in Chicago. We've had a lot of really great investors that have really supported us as we've grown as an organization. We've had some really great partnerships that have really helped us to grow and me to grow as a leader with this organization. I've
Mhm.
been a classroom teacher prior to starting this nonprofit. And so getting that education for myself was really
Mhm.
important as well. I've taken a couple of professional development classes, I've attended conferences to better myself. And, last year we hired Brianna, who is our program manager, and she's kind of taken the charge in leading a lot of our program oversight currently.
Mhm.
And we have a couple of, members of our team that are doing some development work and doing some communications work. So it's really wild to think that 2 years ago right now, I was still teaching and leading an organization full time. And to see where we've come in the past 2 years has been very exciting for me to see my team go from a team of 1 to a team of 4, and to be thinking about going from 3 schools to potentially up to 10
Mhm.
schools next year. So it's been quite the journey.
You know what? That's so interesting because I remember like when we were just at Baker and like you guys are like, oh, you're gonna have another school come in and you get to talk to their bigs.
Mhm.
And I remember coming into that, like talking to them, I'm like, oh my God, you guys are expanding. This is so cool. And now I'm actually like an intern for you guys. I'm like to go from a mentor talking to other mentors to actually being an intern and looking at you expanding beyond my classroom is super dope. And I wanted to go back to something that you said because I thought that was very important. I know we had a conversation about how we think we didn't ease everyone into COVID. I mean, after COVID, the way that we should have.
Yeah.
And I remember like social emotional learning was very big when I was like a mentor. So I know you said like it kind of changed or you had to expand it a bit. What did that look like for, during COVID? Because it was like lockdown. It wasn't a lot of conversations about proper conversations, I think,
Mhm.
about mental health and what does it look like to be living during a pandemic.
Yeah. So we, during that time, hired a social work consultant
Hmm.
to help us identify changes and updates to our curriculum
Hmm.
because we didn't have that expertise on our team at that point. So having her come in was incredibly helpful for me. Like, yes, I was doing restorative education. Yes, I was doing all these really great things in my classroom, but this is a whole different ballgame because we're
Hmm.
talking about kids being in their homes.
Yeah.
And that home life was kind of put on pause when kids were in my classroom. And so that was the forefront now that we were in the pandemic. And
Hmm.
so I think that was something that definitely changed, was realizing honestly and truthfully, we're dealing with everything this kid is also
Yeah.
dealing with in program.
Mhm.
And I think having program virtually and doing those mentee mentorship relationships virtually was very challenging.
Mhm.
And we just kind of went along with it as it happened and like learned new things and new tricks. But it was a lot of talking to experts, reading the research, and figuring out what students need. I think one thing that we have added into our curriculum that we're actually doing an overhaul this summer as well, but will probably be in our curriculum for a while, is this whole idea of decision making.
Mhm.
And I remember reading something as we were heading back into in-person learning after remote learning, because we were still in the pandemic at that point. This idea of decision making and specifically around risk taking, and how young people, because they were at home unable to go anywhere,
Yeah.
that they were preemptively, and they proved themselves to be right, that they were like, young people are going to start making bad decisions. Not from the perspective of young people making bad decisions or to
Right.
make them, but because they weren't able to make those bad decisions in a smaller
Mm.
scale
Mhm.
during the pandemic, because they weren't able to see their friends, they weren't able to go outside and interact with other people. And so, and they're going to go from 0 to 10
Yeah.
in a way that like normally we see like level 2 or level 3 bad decisions, but they're like, no, we're going to see level 10 bad decisions
Like real quick.
real quick. And we definitely saw level 10. We definitely saw level 10 level bad decisions. And I think it was just having, again, rooting ourselves in those same practices of like having conversations, and like when students were maybe struggling, and like let's talk about this. Why did you do this? Well, I felt this way, or I had to do this. And so
Mm.
really trying to meet students where they were at, but also being a little bit preventative and try to figure out, okay, what are the things that students are really going to need? And also how to form relationships. Kids in my classes, I was one of those probably few teachers that did not require my students to be on camera, but
Mhm.
also I didn't want to be on camera. So I was like, if I don't want to be
Yeah.
on camera, I'm not going to force you to be on camera either. And so we didn't see students visually. Kids would participate in the chat, they would come off mute, but they did not want to be on camera.
Mhm.
And so for us figuring out, okay, kids are now going to be seen by other people, right?
Yeah.
So how are we also supporting that? I think that has been the range of kids don't want to sit next to anybody to kids don't know what personal space. Like you have both extremes that you're
Yeah.
dealing with at the same time. And I think that was definitely something that we were not prepared for. But I think, again, at the end of the day, it's rooted in relationships and
Mhm.
boundaries, and the same language that we had been using when it came to how we talked about work and balance and all those other things. We still kept those same principles, but also acknowledge that there's very specific things that students now need that we have to make sure that we're addressing.
Yeah, definitely. That personal space and understanding how to get out of look, when they told us like masks were like not a thing anymore, I'm like, masks not a thing. I
I,
was like, this is scary.
I feel like we should have kept, and we need to go back to those 6 feet apart dots in
Mhm.
the grocery store, because people, once those dots went away, people are right back on them
Right
again. I'm
behind
like,
you.
I need those dots back. I need those dots back ASAP. But no, personal space is actually, like I said, it's been actually an issue that some of our school partners are like, hey, can you address this specifically in program? Because students are
Yeah.
all up in people's spaces. And we can't have that. We need personal space to be a thing.
But just just thinking about the way that, you had to change protocol. I don't want to say change, but expand it for the new circumstances. What did your goals look like for what do your future and present goals look like for mentors and mentees? And versus what did it look like when you first were co-creating the program?
That's a very good question. So when Sean and I started the program, we were very much focused on college going process and
Mhm.
getting more kids to college. And I don't think that was a bad approach to it. I think
Mhm.
that at the time we saw the data around how many students actively wanted to go
Mhm.
versus how many students were actually going. And I think we've used the 2 and 3 projects, resources, and research as a guiding force for us as an organization to figure out what are the things, what are the strategies, what are the things that we need to know to be able to make sure we are supporting ninth grade students to and through
Mhm.
high school, which is where their name comes from. But I think as we've gone into the pandemic and we've talked to our students, both students that were participants during the pandemic and coming out of it, I think we're starting to see a cultural shift, as well as I think the student debt crisis and the
Mm.
conversations around
Mhm.
that. A
Mhm.
lot of students are concerned about higher education and they're concerned about their preparedness for it. They're concerned about the cost for it. And
Mhm.
so we've seen students that are maybe not going directly into a higher education institution right after they graduate high school. And we want to make sure that we're including those students and we're supporting those students as well. So I
Mhm.
think our goal initially was to make our mentors more competitive for college through providing them with the skills to feel comfortable in college settings
Mhm.
and with the kind of materials and ideas to put on their resume to make them look more impressive to those selective schools, because we just know historically those kinds of schools have higher graduation rates and just have more resources to support our students, which were
Mhm.
mostly first generation students.
Yes.
So that was our big push in the beginning. Our goals for our mentees in the beginning was to get them to stay at the school. At the time, Baker
Mm.
had, and
Mhm.
we've talked about this before,
Yeah.
how Baker had a huge problem with retaining ninth grade students. And
Yeah.
so that was actually also part of why we specifically want to focus on ninth grade when we created the program, was because we saw a lot of students transferring out
Mhm.
after ninth grade. And so our goal was to, one, get the ninth graders to stay, and the number two, making sure they were set up with successful skills to graduate from high school.
Mhm.
So that was our focus when we started. I don't think we've moved away from those focus. I think those things are still very
Mhm.
important to us, but I do think this idea of not just college graduation, but
Mm.
what are students doing after they graduate college? Or if they choose not to go, are they career ready? And
Mhm.
that can mean a variety of things. So we as an organization are reflecting this summer on how are we discussing and setting benchmarks and goals around career readiness for our students versus just college readiness,
Mm.
because
Mhm.
we want to acknowledge, again, those concerns I said earlier that students have around affordability of college and just their overall maturity and academic preparedness for college.
Mhm.
So by focusing on careers and not just college, we're actually thinking ahead, especially now that our first cohort of ninth grade students they just wrapped their second year of college if they went. Right.
Okay.
And so we're going to have more students that are going to be entering the workforce from our program within the next 5 years.
Mm.
And so we have to make sure that our program is also able to help them not just get through high school, but then after they graduate college or if they go straight into the workforce after college. So
Mhm.
that's where we're making some maybe pivots as an organization, but I still think college is very important for us. And we acknowledge the importance that college can have and just the interest that our students have in going to college and
Mhm.
learning more, and the career options that they might have or they might want to pursue that might require them still to have a college degree.
Mhm. I want to say thank you so much for joining me. I just want to say thank you so much for being in the space to be my educator and be my big mentor and be my boss now, even though that sounds so weird because I just still see you as like my teacher. But this conversation has been great and has been phenomenal. And I feel like I learned so much. And I'm so happy that you brought me back to be a part of the journey because I still talk about this program to this day in my classes to anybody that will listen. Before we end, I always like to ask my guests to drop that knowledge. You dropped a lot. You said a lot of good things. But what is something that you want the people to take? That one thing or two things, whatever.
I think that I'll say two things. I think that the kids are all right. And when I say that, I mean that young people, we talked about resilience of young people during the pandemic.
Mhm.
Young people have always had resilience. Young people have always had desire to want to be independent and want to be leaders.
Mhm.
And we as older people need to respect that respect their opinions, respect their thoughts, and we need to support them whenever possible so that they can continue to be all right. That's the first thing I will say. The second thing I will say is that education as an industry is changing. And I
Mm,
think that people have to be open to the changing factors that are happening in education. Because I
mhm,
think at the end of the day, what it boils down to, what it should always boil down to, is being better, is making us better to be able to serve students.
mhm,
And so, my fellow educators out there, be open to these changes that are happening. I know sometimes we get stuck in our ways and we want to do the things that we have these nice, beautiful binders and plans from lessons that we've taught for years and years. And sometimes there's a time for you to let go of those things
mhm,
and think about something new because we are in unprecedented times.
mhm,
We have survived a pandemic, and that's going to require us to have to respond to what are some of the challenges that our students are facing coming out of it.
mhm.
And our openness is going to be key to us surviving this as an industry and also for our students to be better able to serve us as leaders in the future.
I think, oh, that was great. Oh, sometimes when my guests say things, it makes me not want to speak after them. But I'm gonna say something anyway, though. Um, I think my knowledge that I would just want people, specifically educators, to take with them, don't be afraid to be authentic to yourself
Mm,
because authenticity is going to create the authenticity within your students to continue to strive because they're only going to be as great as you allow them to be.
absolutely.
And then second, don't be afraid to expand upon the good work that you're already doing.
Mhm.
Because I feel like sometimes we get so bogged in our good idea that we have right now. And when we see the greatness of it, we get scared and we want to stay there. But we gotta be able to expand because the expansion upon ourselves is going to be the greater good for everyone around us, whether it be students and colleagues and other educators. But again, thank you so much for joining me. I really wanted this to happen. When I thought it was going to happen, I was really sad. So this was great. Thank y'all for tuning in to another episode of What's Going On, a Social Studies Network podcast. Peace.